If you close your eyes and think of the Vietnam War, what do you hear? For most Americans, the soundtrack of that war is deafening. It is the rhythmic whop 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 of the UH-1 Huey helicopter blades cutting through the humid air. It is the earth-shaking roar of B-52 Stratofortresses delivering arc-light strikes that turn square miles of triple canopy jungle into moonscapes. It is the crack of the M16 rifle on full auto, the spray and pray of a young draftee caught in an ambush, and the thunderous reply of artillery batteries firing from heavily fortified fire bases. This was the American way of war in the 1,960 seconds. It was a doctrine built on a simple, industrial premise. Overwhelm the enemy with superior firepower. We brought civilization's might into the wilderness. We cleared landing zones with explosives. We burned away the concealment with napalm, and we measured success by body counts. The logic was that if we could just pour enough steel and high explosives into the tree line, the enemy would eventually break. But deep in the sweltering mangroves and rubber plantations of Phuoc Tuy province, southeast of Saigon, a very different kind of war was being fought. Here, the jungle didn't roar, it whispered. In this sector, the Viet Cong, VC, and the North Vietnamese Army, NVA, hardened guerrillas who had spent decades fighting the French and the Japanese, encountered a terrifying anomaly. They faced an enemy who didn't arrive in a storm of helicopter wash. They faced an enemy who didn't clear the jungle but seemed to merge with it. These soldiers didn't wear the standard US steel pot helmets. They wore soft-brimmed bush hats. They didn't carry the jamming-prone M16S. They carried heavy, long-barreled L1A1 SLR rifles. And perhaps most unnervingly, they didn't smoke, they didn't talk, and they didn't use deodorant or soap that would smell foreign to the environment. They were the Australian Special Air Service Regiment, SASR. And to the Viet Cong, they were a nightmare that American firepower could never replicate. To understand why they were so feared, you have to understand the psychology of the insurgent. The Viet Cong were masters of the ambush. They owned the terrain. Against the Americans, the VC held the initiative. They knew when the Americans were coming because the Americans were loud. A US battalion moving through the bush was a noisy, clanking machine. The scent of American tobacco, the sound of radio squawking, and the heavy footsteps of soldiers weighed down by excessive gear gave the VC ample time to decide, fight or fade away. But with the Australians, that equation was reversed. Intelligence reports captured from VC headquarters later in the war revealed a chilling directive. The orders explicitly stated that if a unit encountered American troops, they were to engage or withdraw based on their tactical advantage. However, if they encountered Australians, the order was simple: withdraw immediately. Do not engage unless cornered. Why? It wasn't because the Australians had better guns or more air support, they actually had significantly less of both. It was because the Australians stripped away the insurgents' greatest advantage: invisibility. The Viet Cong began to report strange phenomena. Patrols would vanish without a single shot being fired, their throats slit in the night. Supply caches that had been hidden for years were suddenly destroyed with pinpoint accuracy, yet no footprints were found leading to them. Entire VC platoons would feel like they were being watched, a prickling sensation on the back of their necks, only to scan the tree line and see nothing but swaying bamboo. They gave these men a name, Ma Rừng, the Phantoms of the Jungle. This wasn't just a nickname, it was a recognition of a supernatural level of tradecraft. The Australian SAS operated in small teams, usually just 4 to 6 men. They moved so slowly that they might cover only a few hundred yards in an hour. They didn't seek to conquer the territory, they sought to infest it. They became the eyes and ears that the massive American war machine desperately lacked. But this unique capability didn't appear out of thin air. These men weren't just rugged boys from the Australian outback relying on intuition. They were the product of a very specific, very rigorous lineage. They were the inheritors of a military philosophy that was the exact opposite of the American doctrine of firepower. They were the students of the British. Before they ever set foot in Vietnam, the Australian SAS had been forged in the fires of the Malayan Emergency and the jungles of Borneo, trained by the legendary British SAS. They were taught that in the jungle, silence is more lethal than a machine gun, and patience is the only armor that matters. While the US military was rewriting the book on air, mobility, and heavy assault, the Australians were perfecting a deadly art form passed down from their British mentors: And as the Vietnam War ground on, it became increasingly clear. The British had written the theory, but the Australians were about to prove it in the most unforgiving classroom on Earth. The supernatural stealth of the Australian SAS in Vietnam didn't originate in the Australian outback. While the rugged terrain of Western Australia produced tough men, the specific science of their warfare was imported from the misty, leech-infested highlands of Southeast Asia. It was a doctrine written in blood and sweat by the British Special Air Service, SAS, during the Malayan Emergency. In the 1,950 seconds, while the United States was largely focused on the looming threat of Soviet tanks rolling through the Fulda Gap in Europe, the British were fighting a very different kind of war in Malaya. They were battling communist insurgents who dissolved into the jungle the moment contact was made. It was here, in this dirty war, that the British resurrected the SAS, a unit that had been disbanded after World War II and tasked them with a new mission: deep jungle penetration. When the Australian SAS company was formed in 1957, they didn't just read the British manuals, they lived them. Many of the founding officers and NCOs of the Australian SAS had served alongside the British 22 SAS Regiment in Malaya and later in Borneo. They were the apprentices to the masters of counterinsurgency. The British philosophy was radically different from the conventional military doctrine of the time. The standard Western approach to war, the one that the US would later double down on in Vietnam, was based on the concept of attrition. The idea was simple: kill the enemy faster than they can replace their losses. To do this, you use maximum force. You conquer the terrain, you bulldoze the trees, pave the roads, and bring your logistics train with you. The British taught the Australians the exact opposite: do not fight the jungle. The British Jungle Warfare School mantra was that the jungle is neutral. It is ruthless, yes, but it does not take sides. If you fight against it, if you try to chop it down, yell over its noise, or march through it like you're on a parade ground, the jungle will kill you before the enemy ever gets the chance. Heat exhaustion, malaria, and foot rot will be your undoing. But if you accept the jungle, if you move with its rhythm and use its cover, it becomes your fortress. This mindset created a fundamental split in how Australian Special Forces operated compared to their American counterparts. The American Green Berets, Special Forces, were undoubtedly elite, but their primary mission in Vietnam was initially foreign internal defense training indigenous troops, like the Montagnards, to fight. They operated out of fortified camps. They were force multipliers. When they went on patrol, they were often heavily armed, expecting a fight. The Australians, following the British blueprint, were trained primarily for recce, reconnaissance. Their job wasn't to find a fight, it was to find the enemy and not fight. This required a level of discipline that bordered on the masochistic. In the British training camps in Malaya, Australian soldiers were taught to exist in a state of hyper-awareness. They learned that the human nose is a liability. The scent of standard issue soap, toothpaste, or tobacco smoke can travel hundreds of yards in humid air. So before a patrol, they stopped smoking. They stopped using soap. They ate garlic to mask their scent, or simply allowed the natural grime of the bush to cover them. They were taught the shoot and scoop tactic. In a conventional war, if you make contact, you fix the enemy with machine gun fire and maneuver to flank them. The British taught the Australians that in a small four-man team deep behind enemy lines, getting pinned down meant death. If contact was unavoidable, the drill was to unleash a wall of automatic fire to shock the enemy, break contact immediately, and vanish. But perhaps the most critical lesson the British passed down was the concept of hearts and minds. This phrase has become a cliche today, often mocked as soft politics. But to the British SAS, it was a tactical reality. In Malaya, they learned that you cannot kill your way out of an insurgency. If the local population hates you, the enemy will always have a safe harbor. The Australians absorbed this completely. While American units would later rely on free fire zones where anything moving was considered a target, the Australian doctrine emphasized restraint. In their training, they were drilled to view the civilian population not as an obstacle, but as the prize. By the time the first Australian combat troops arrived in Vietnam in 1965, the SAS Regiment had spent nearly a decade honing these skills. They weren't going in blind. They were entering the war with a specific, polished toolkit designed for exactly this environment. However, a classroom is one thing, the exam is another. The British had taught them how to survive in the jungle and how to outsmart an insurgent. But the Viet Cong were not the Malayan communist rebels. The VC were better armed, better organized, and backed by the regular North Vietnamese army. The Australians arrived in Vietnam carrying the British torch, confident in their jungle school methods. But as they stepped off the plains into the searing heat of Southeast Asia, the Americans looked at their light kits, their funny hats, and their bolt-action attitudes with skepticism. The U.S. military machine was revving up to fight a war of massive proportions. To the American commanders, these quiet Australians looked like they were bringing a knife to a nuclear gunfight. They were about to realize that in the thick canopy of Vietnam, a knife in the dark is exactly what you need. When the Americans went into the jungle, they usually went looking for a fight. When the Australian SAS went into the jungle, they went looking for information. And to get information in Phuoc Tuy province without getting killed, you had to do something that went against every instinct of a modern soldier. You had to slow down. To the average American infantryman, the grunt, the jungle was an obstacle to be overcome. It was a green hell of vines, wait a minute thorns, and claustrophobic heat. American patrols often moved with a sense of urgency, hacking through the vegetation with machetes, their progress marked by the snapping of branches and the murmur of radio chatter. Their goal was to reach an objective, sweep an area, and establish a presence. The SAS patrol, by contrast, didn't look like a military maneuver. It looked like a hunt. A standard SAS patrol consisted of just 4 to 5 men. This small number was deliberate. In the mathematics of stealth, every extra set of boots increases the probability of detection exponentially. They moved in a spread-out formation, keeping visual contact but staying far enough apart that a single burst of enemy machine gun fire or a grenade couldn't take out the whole team. But it was how they moved that created the legend of the Phantom. They practiced what became known as the SAS shuffle. They didn't march, they flowed. A point man wouldn't just stomp his boot onto the ground. He would place the toe first, rolling his weight gently to the heel, feeling for dry twigs or loose rocks before committing his full weight. If he felt something snap, he froze. The whole team froze. They would stand like statues in the dripping humidity, sometimes for 5 or 10 minutes just listening. Was that a monkey, or was it the click of an AK-47 safety catch? This extreme caution meant their pace was excruciatingly slow. A standard infantry unit might cover 4 or 5 kilometers in a few hours. An SAS patrol might take 6 hours to cover just 1 kilometer. To an outsider, this looked like madness. Why move so slowly? Because the point man wasn't just looking for enemy soldiers. He was reading the jungle like a forensic crime scene. The British had taught them that the jungle tells a story if you know the language. The point man looked for the sign. A broken spiderweb across a trail meant someone had passed through recently. A leaf turned over to reveal its lighter underside meant a foot had scuffed it. A patch of mud that was drying differently than the surrounding earth indicated a boot print. They smelled the air for the faint, sweet scent of nuoc mam, fish sauce, or the acrid odor of unwashed bodies, which could betray a Viet Cong position hundreds of yards away. This level of focus required a discipline that was almost inhuman. It was called hard routine. Once an SAS patrol was inserted, usually by helicopter, dropping into a small clearing and vanishing into the tree line. Within seconds, the hard routine began. There was no talking. None. For weeks at a time, men communicated entirely by hand signals. A raised fist for halt, a flat hand for get down, a finger across the throat for enemy. There were no campfires. While American troops back at base were eating hot chow, the SAS ate cold rations out of tins. They didn't heat their water for tea, because the smell of hexamine tablets burning could drift for a mile. They didn't smoke. They didn't shave. They didn't use insect repellent because the chemical smell was a dead giveaway. They simply let the mosquitoes bite and the leeches latch on. Imagine the psychological toll of that existence. You are deep in enemy territory, outnumbered hundreds to 1. You are soaked in sweat, covered in fungal infections, and exhausted. Yet, you cannot make a sound. You cannot sneeze. You cannot cough. If you have to relieve yourself, you bury it immediately and camouflage the spot. You become a ghost in the truest sense, present, but leaving no physical evidence of your existence. This invisibility gave them a terrifying advantage. The element of surprise was absolute. The Viet Cong were used to the American rhythm. They knew that Americans made noise. They knew Americans stayed on trails or near clearings for extraction. The VC felt safe deep in the thick bamboo, believing the terrain protected them. But the SAS didn't use trails. They moved through the thickest, nastiest scrub specifically because the enemy didn't expect anyone to be there. There are stories of SAS patrols moving so quietly that they would stumble upon Viet Cong rest camps and walk right into the middle of them before anyone realized what was happening. In one instance, an SAS point man parted some large fern fronds and found himself face to face with the VC sentry who was looking the other way, listening for the loud footsteps of American soldiers. The sentry never heard the Australian who was 3 feet behind him. By early 1967, the results of this art of the shadow were becoming undeniable. The Australians were gathering intelligence of such high quality that they were mapping entire enemy tunnel systems and supply routes without the enemy knowing they had been compromised. But gathering intelligence was only half the job. The British had taught them to watch. Vietnam demanded that they strike. And when the SAS decided to stop watching and start shooting, the Phantom didn't just haunt the jungle, it devoured it. War is often described as long periods of boredom, punctuated by moments of sheer terror. For the American infantryman in Vietnam, those moments of terror were usually prolonged firefights, hours of exchanging lead, calling in airstrikes, and maneuvering flanks. But for the Australian SAS, the war didn't happen in hours, it happened in seconds. There is a specific, chilling mathematics to an SAS ambush. It is the practical application of the British hit-and-run doctrine, refined to a razor's edge. If the art of the shadow was about being invisible, this phase was about becoming a sudden, overwhelming force of nature. The SAS called it the deliberate ambush. Imagine the scene. You are deep in enemy territory. You are 5 men. Intelligence suggests a Viet Cong supply column is moving down a specific jungle track. You don't have a company of Marines behind you. You don't have a tank platoon. You have your rifles, your wits, and a bag of M18A1 Claymore mines. The setup is a masterpiece of geometry. The patrol locates a kill zone, a stretch of the trail where the enemy is most vulnerable and has nowhere to run. They plant the Claymores, curved plastic boxes packed with C4 explosive and hundreds of steel ball bearings, facing the trail. They camouflage the wires meticulously. Then, they wait. This is where the discipline discussed in the previous chapter becomes a weapon. The patrol might wait for 12 hours, 24 hours, or even 2 days. They lie in the dirt, weapon stocks pressed to their shoulders, sweating, cramping, insects crawling over their skin. They do not move, they wait for the optimum moment. In American doctrine, the tendency was often to open fire as soon as the enemy was sighted. It was a reaction to a threat. The Australian doctrine was different. You let the enemy walk right into your lap. You let the scout pass. You let the point man pass. You wait until the main body of the force, the officer, the heavy weapons carrier, the radio operator, is directly in front of the Claymores. April 1967, Route 328, east of Juan Moc. An SAS patrol from 2 Squadron is in position. They have waited 18 hours. Finally, dusk approaches. A squad of 12 Viet Cong fighters appears, moving confidently, carrying AK-47 seconds, RPGs, and mortar shells. They are chatting quietly, weapons slung over shoulders. They have no idea that 5 Australians are lying in the bush less than 20 meters away. The ambush commander holds the clacker, the detonator for the Claymores. He watches the enemy file into the zone. He counts them. He waits until the entire column is exposed. The silence of the jungle is absolute. And then, the commander squeezes the clacker. Click. The explosion is instantaneous and deafening. The Claymores turn the trail into a shredding machine. Thousands of steel bearings scream through the kill zone at waist height. This is the initiation. In that same split second, the 5 SAS troopers open fire with their SLRs and M16S. But they don't just spray bullets. They fire controlled rapid shots into specific targets. The drill is brutal. Double tap. 2 rounds to the chest. If the target is still moving, 1 to the head. The violence is compressed, concentrated, and absolute. In the incident on Route 328, the ambush lasted exactly 4 seconds. 4 seconds. In the time it takes you to take a deep breath and exhale, 12 enemy soldiers were neutralized. There was no return fire. There was no maneuvering. The enemy didn't even have time to unsling their rifles. But what happened next separates the SAS from almost everyone else. A conventional American unit, having wiped out an enemy squad, would secure the perimeter, radio it in, maybe search the bodies for intel, and wait for a chopper to extract them or a cleanup crew to arrive. They would claim the ground. The SAS did the opposite. They ran. Immediately after the ceasefire signal, the patrol would conduct a search that lasted no more than a minute or two, grabbing documents, weapons, or maps. And then they would bug out. Why? Because of the math. The SAS knew that in Phuoc Tuy province, you were never just fighting a squad. That squad was the tip of an iceberg. The noise of the ambush was a dinner bell for every other Viet Cong unit within 3 miles. The Australians knew that a reaction force angry, heavily armed, and numbering in the hundreds would be on its way within minutes. The patrol would vanish back into the jungle, moving at a sprint for the first few hundred meters to clear the area, then dropping back into their ghostly, slow-motion stealth. By the time the Viet Cong reinforcements arrived at the kill zone on Route 328, just 24 minutes later, all they found were their fallen comrades and the smell of cordite. The Australians were gone. The jungle was silent again. This tactic was psychologically devastating to the Viet Cong. It wasn't a battle, it was an assassination. When you fight an American unit, you get a chance to be a hero. You get to shoot back. You get to die for the cause in a blaze of glory. When you met the SAS, you just died. The VC survivors of other engagements started to spread the word. The Australians didn't fight fair. They didn't stand and fight. They struck like lightning and evaporated like smoke. But as terrifying as the ambushes were, the greatest impact the SAS had wasn't just in the bodies they left on the trail. It was in the minds of the men who were still alive. The SAS had managed to do the impossible. They had terrified the terrorists. By 1967, the war in Vietnam had settled into a bloody rhythm. The Americans and the North Vietnamese were trading heavy blows in the Central Highlands and near the DMZ. But in the Australian sector of Phuoc Tuy, a different kind of damage was being inflicted. It wasn't damage to bunkers or bridges, it was damage to the enemy's mind. The Viet Cong, VC, were not easily rattled. These were men and women who had endured decades of conflict. They had survived French guillotines and American napalm. They were disciplined, ideologically driven, and incredibly tough. They could sleep in tunnels filled with stagnant water and march for days on a handful of rice. But the Australian SAS broke them. The primary objective of the SAS was reconnaissance, but the byproduct of their presence was a crippling psychological siege. For the first time in the war, the Viet Cong lost the one thing that allowed them to function, the feeling of safety in their own backyard. In military terms, this is called denial of terrain. Usually, you deny terrain by parking a tank on it. The SAS denied terrain by simply existing. Because the SAS operated in such small teams and left no trace, the Viet Cong never knew where they were. A 4-man patrol could monitor a trail for days, and the VC would have no idea. This created a pervasive sense of paranoia. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig, every shadow that looked slightly too dark became a potential death sentence. We know this not just from Australian after-action reports, but from the enemy's own words. Throughout the late 1962, Australian intelligence officers began recovering documents from captured VC command posts. Among the propaganda, leaflets, and supply manifests, they found directives that stunned them. One captured document from the VC Provincial Command in Phuoc Tuy issued a stark warning to its battalion commanders. It acknowledged that American forces, while powerful, were predictable. They relied on technology and noise. "We can hear them coming," the report noted. "We can prepare." But regarding the Australians, the tone shifted to genuine alarm. The document described the Australian forces as worse than the Americans because they possessed a technique of guerrilla warfare superior to our own. Then came the directive that has since become legendary in military history. The order effectively stated, "Do not engage Australian reconnaissance units unless you are sure of victory. If you encounter them, withdraw immediately." Think about the weight of that order. An insurgent force fighting for its homeland was telling its soldiers to run away from a handful of men. This wasn't cowardice, it was a calculated survival strategy. The VC commanders realized that engaging an SAS patrol was a trap. If you fired at the 4 men you saw, you were likely firing into a diversion while the real threat artillery called in by the patrol or a flanking maneuver was already in motion. Or worse, you were shooting at ghosts who would vanish and then hunt you down one by one on your way back to base. The psychological impact extended to the VC's daily routine. In areas where the SAS was known to operate, VC morale plummeted. Soldiers became afraid to move at night, formerly their safest time. Supply columns, which used to move freely down the Ho Chi Minh Trail spurs, began to slow to a crawl. Porters refused to carry ammo crates through certain sectors of the jungle because they believed spirits were watching them. One former Viet Cong platoon commander, interviewed decades after the war, described the feeling of fighting the Australians. With the Americans, it was a storm. You hunker down, you wait for it to pass, and then you come out. With the Australians, it was like a sickness in the jungle. You never knew if you were safe. You would walk past a bush, and 5 minutes later, your friend behind you will be dead. But you saw no one. This is where the nickname Ma Rung Phantoms of the Jungle truly took root. It wasn't just a name, it was an admission of helplessness. The SAS had effectively turned the Viet Cong's greatest strength against them. The jungle was supposed to be the insurgents' cloak. The Australians stole that cloak and wore it themselves. They proved that a small group of highly disciplined men, armed with patience and silence, could paralyze a much larger force simply by making them afraid to take a step. The hunters had become the hunted, and as the war dragged on, the sheer efficiency of these phantoms would be measured not just in fear, but in a kill ratio that defied all statistical logic. In the grim ledger of the Vietnam War, success was measured in a metric that General William Westmoreland called the body count. It was a cold industrial calculation. If we kill more of them than they kill of us, eventually they will quit. For the American military machine, achieving this ratio was an expensive endeavor. It required millions of gallons of jet fuel, mountains of artillery shells, fleets of helicopters, and battalions of young men drafted from towns across the United States. The average infantry exchange rate hovered around 2-to-1 or 3-to-1. For elite units like the Green Berets or Navy SEALs, it was significantly higher, perhaps 10-to-1 or 20-to-1. But when the Australian SAS commanders crunched their numbers at the end of the war, the result was so statistically lopsided it looked like a clerical error. Between 1,966 and 1,971, the Australian SAS Regiment conducted approximately 1,200 patrols in Phuoc Tuy province. They confirmed 492 enemy soldiers killed in action and captured 106 more. Their own combat losses? 3. That is a kill ratio of roughly 164-to-1. Let that number sink in. For every single SAS trooper lost in a firefight, they eliminated an entire company of Viet Cong. In the history of modern warfare, such a disparity is almost unheard of. But the math of the ghost goes deeper than just the kill ratio. It reveals a stark contrast in what military strategists call economy of force. The American approach to Vietnam was one of abundance. If a U.S. platoon took sniper fire from a tree line, the standard response was to call in an airstrike or an artillery barrage. A single engagement might cost hundreds of thousands of dollars in munitions and fuel. It was effective at suppressing the enemy, but it was economically and logistically exhausting. The Australian SAS approach was one of extreme scarcity. A 5-man patrol would insert with enough rations and ammunition for 2 weeks. They had no heavy weapons. They rarely called for air support because they were often too close to the enemy to use it safely. When an SAS trooper pulled the trigger, it wasn't suppressive fire. It was a calculated investment. They didn't spray the jungle hoping to hit something. They fired only when they had a clear target and a guaranteed kill. This efficiency was born out of necessity, but also out of doctrine. The British SAS had taught them that a small team behind enemy lines cannot afford a fair fight. If the odds are 50-over-50, you don't engage, you hide. If the odds are 70-over-30, you withdraw. You only strike when the odds are 100% in your favor when the enemy is eating, sleeping, or walking blindly into a kill zone you've spent 10 hours preparing. This discipline meant that the SAS passed up far more targets than they engaged. They would watch an enemy squad walk by, counting their weapons and mapping their route, rather than opening fire and revealing their position. To an American commander, letting the enemy walk away might seem like a missed opportunity. To the SAS, it was intelligence gathering. And intelligence, as it turned out, was far more lethal than bullets. While the 164-to-1 kill ratio is the headline statistic, the true damage the SAS inflicted was through the airstrikes and artillery missions they directed. Because they were phantoms invisible observers, sitting silently just meters from major enemy encampments, they could call in fire missions with terrifying precision. In Operation Portsea in 1967, for example, The SAS provided the intelligence that allowed Australian task forces to dismantle major VC tunnel complexes. They didn't need to kick down the doors themselves. They just needed to tell the big guns exactly where to aim. The disparity in casualties also highlights the difference in survival philosophy. The 3 SAS men killed in action during patrols were tragic losses, felt deeply by the regiment. But the number is shockingly low for a unit that spent its entire war operating behind enemy lines. This wasn't luck. It was the result of the cross-training discussed earlier. In a U.S. platoon, if the medic is hit, the unit loses its medical capability. If the radio operator is hit, the unit is cut off. In an SAS patrol, every man was a medic, every man was a navigator, every man could operate the radio and call in artillery. This redundancy meant that even if a patrol took a casualty, they didn't lose their operational effectiveness. They could still fight, maneuver, and extract. The math of the ghost proved a controversial point to the military observers of the time. You don't need a sledgehammer to crack a nut. Sometimes a needle is far more effective. The Americans brought the sledgehammer. They flattened mountains and burned forests. The Australians brought the needle. They slipped between the ribs of the enemy's defense and struck the heart. But statistics are cold comfort to the men on the ground. Behind the 164-to-1 ratio were human beings pushing themselves to the brink of insanity. The psychological toll of maintaining that level of perfection, of knowing that one snapped twig or one cough meant death, was immense. The ghosts were winning the war in the jungle, but the jungle was taking its toll on the ghost. It is easy, decades later, to look at the kill ratio of 164-to-1 and view the Australian SAS as superhuman. The legend of the Phantom suggests a kind of mystical warrior, invulnerable, stoic, and effortless. But if you strip away the mythology and look at the photographs of these men returning from a patrol, you see a different story. You see ribs protruding through skin. You see eyes sunken deep into skulls, ringed with dark circles of exhaustion. You see uniforms rotting off their bodies. The price of being a ghost was physical and mental disintegration. To achieve the level of stealth required to survive in Phuoc Tuy province, the SAS had to live in a state of hard routine. In the sterile language of military manuals, hard routine means minimizing noise and movement. In reality, it meant living like a hunted animal for weeks at a time. The first enemy was the body itself. Because scent discipline was paramount, washing was forbidden, soap was a beacon to the enemy. So, for 14 days in the humidity of the rainy season, men stewed in their own sweat, grime, and waste. The result was a medical nightmare. Fungal infections, known as tinea or jungle rot, would spread aggressively across their bodies. It started in the groin and the armpits, raw and weeping, then moved to the feet. Men would return from patrol with their socks stuck to their skin by dried blood and pus. When they peeled the socks off, layers of skin came with them. Leeches were a constant torment. They would crawl into boot eyelets, up pant legs, and even into urethras. In a normal unit, you burn a leech off with a cigarette or pull it off and curse. In an SAS ambush position, you couldn't light a cigarette, and you couldn't move to pull it off. You just lay there and let it feed until it fell off on its own, feeling the warm trickle of blood down your leg. Then there was the exhaustion. An SAS patrol operated on a sleep deficit that would drive an ordinary person into psychosis. They moved by day and sometimes by night. When they did stop to rest in a harbor position, they slept in a wagon wheel formation, feet touching in the center so one man could wake the others with a gentle nudge. But sleep is a generous term. It was a series of terrified catnaps. One ear was always listening, one eye was always half open. The sound of a falling branch or a lizard scurrying through the dry leaves would jolt them instantly into a state of adrenaline-fueled combat readiness. This hypervigilance took a massive psychological toll. Imagine being surrounded by 2,000 enemy soldiers who want to kill you, and your survival depends entirely on you not snapping a twig. You are 4 men against a battalion. The stress hormone cortisol flooded their systems 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The discipline required to maintain this state was illustrated by the now famous story of the ant. During one patrol, an SAS trooper was lying in the prone position, serving as the rear guard for an ambush. He was perfectly camouflaged, motionless, his breathing shallow and controlled. A column of Viet Cong soldiers was moving down the trail, less than 30 meters away. Suddenly, A column of aggressive biting ants, likely weaver ants or driver ants, swarmed over his legs and torso. Any normal human reaction would be to jump up, brush them off, and scream. But to move meant revealing the position. It meant the death of his 3 teammates. So, the trooper did nothing. He lay perfectly still while hundreds of ants bit into his flesh. He didn't twitch, he didn't make a sound, he simply absorbed the pain, channeling it into focus. Later, after the patrol extracted, he counted over 112 individual bites on his body. This wasn't just toughness, it was a suppression of the survival instinct for the sake of the mission. This level of stress changed men. Veterans speak of the post-patrol come-down. When the helicopter finally picked them up and brought them back to the base at Nui Dat, they couldn't just switch off. They would walk into the mess hall, filthy and smelling of the jungle, staring at the rear echelon troops, drinking beer and watching movies, and feel like aliens. They had trouble sleeping in beds. The silence of a room felt wrong. They needed the noise of the jungle to feel oriented. Many admitted that they felt safer in the bush than they did in civilization. In the bush, the rules were simple. Stay quiet, stay alive. In the base, the complexities of life returned. The bond that formed between these 4-man teams was absolute. It went beyond friendship. They knew the sound of each other's breathing. They knew how each man walked. They trusted each other with their lives every single second of every single day. If one man failed, they all died. This shared suffering created a unit cohesion that American commanders could only dream of. American soldiers were rotated individually in and out of units for a 1-year tour, the Darrow system, which often destroyed unit integrity. The SAS trained together, deployed together, fought together, and suffered together. They were phantoms to the enemy, but to each other, they were the only thing that was real. They endured the rot, the leeches, the ants, and the terror not for the flag, or for democracy, or for the queen. They endured it for the man lying in the mud next to them. Ready for part 8? Next, we will look at the legacy of the ghost. We will discuss how the lessons learned in Vietnam by the SAS didn't just stay in the jungle, they were brought back and became the foundation for modern Special Forces doctrine worldwide, influencing everything from the Delta Force to the modern SASR. By late 1971, the roar of the war in Phuoc Tuy province began to fade. The Australian task force withdrew from Nui Dat, leaving the red dust and the rubber plantations behind. The helicopters flew away, the fire bases were dismantled, and the jungle began its slow, inevitable work of reclaiming the trails where men had hunted one another for years. The war would continue for another 4 years before the fall of Saigon, but for the Australian SAS, the mission was over. They went home to a country that was increasingly divided by the conflict, receiving a cold reception from a public tired of war. However, within the quiet, classified walls of military academies and special forces headquarters around the world, a different reception was taking place. The phantoms were being studied. The Vietnam War had been a brutal testing ground for 2 competing philosophies of warfare. The American model, massive firepower, technological superiority, and attrition had struggled to defeat a low-tech insurgent force. The British-Australian model, small footprint, high intelligence, and cultural adaptability had achieved tactical dominance in its sector. The legacy of the SAS in Vietnam was the proof that the British blueprint, when applied with Australian grit, was not just a relic of the colonial era, it was the future of modern warfare. The first major legacy was the validation of the Long-Range Reconnaissance Patrol, LRRP, concept. Before Vietnam, many conventional commanders viewed special forces as cowboys useful for sabotage, but not essential to the main battle. The SAS proved that a 4-man team, armed with nothing but radios and patience, could be more lethal than a battalion of tanks. They shifted the focus of special forces from just kicking down doors to watching the house. This shift influenced military doctrine globally. The United States, having seen the effectiveness of the SAS and their own LRRP units, began to place a higher premium on small unit reconnaissance. The exchange of knowledge between the U.S. Green Berets, the Navy SEALs, and the SASR deepened. The Recondo schools established in Vietnam incorporated many of the tracking and survival techniques that the Australians had perfected. The respect was mutual. American Special Forces admired the Australians' field craft, while the Australians admired the Americans' insertion capabilities. Secondly, Vietnam forged the Australian SASR's unique identity. Prior to the war, they were seen by many as simply an offshoot of the British SAS, the colonials following the mother country's manual. Vietnam changed that. The Australian SASR had fought a different war than their British mentors had in Malaya. They had faced a more aggressive, better armed enemy in a more hostile political environment. They came out of the jungle, not as students, but as masters. They had developed their own standard operating procedures, SOPs, that were distinct from the British. They had proven that they could operate independently, without the massive support structure that British units often enjoyed in Europe. The Australian way defined by humility, egalitarianism, where a private could correct an officer if it meant saving the patrol, and extreme endurance became a brand of its own. This legacy became crucial in the decades that followed, specifically as the world transitioned from jungle warfare to the age of counterterrorism, CT. In the late 1970s, following the Munich Olympics massacre and the Hilton Hotel bombing in Sydney, the SASR was tasked with creating a domestic counterterrorism capability. On the surface, storming a building to rescue hostages seems like the opposite of a silent jungle patrol. But the DNA was the same. The discipline required to distinguish a Viet Cong guerrilla from a harmless rice farmer in a split second was the exact same cognitive skill required to distinguish a terrorist from a hostage in a crowded room. The shoot divided by no shoot discrimination that the SAS had mastered in the chaos of the jungle became the foundation of their close quarter battle CQB tactics. The patience developed by lying in an ambush for 48 hours translated perfectly to the patience required for a sniper team waiting for a clear shot during a siege. Fast forward to the 21st century. When the war on terror began in the mountains of Afghanistan, the ghost of Vietnam returned. Australian SAS squadrons were among the first boots on the ground in 2001. Once again, they found themselves in a hostile, unforgiving environment against an elusive, insurgent enemy. And once again, they reverted to the lessons of Phuc Tui. They grew beards to blend in with the local population, hearts and minds. They operated in small teams, deep in enemy territory for weeks, far from support, hard routine. They drove civilian vehicles and used local pack animals. American commanders, struggling with the rugged terrain, often looked at the Australians with a sense of deja vu. The technology had changed. They now had satellite comms and laser designators instead of maps and compasses, but the tactic was identical. Be invisible. Watch. Strike only when you can win. The Vietnam War is often remembered as a strategic failure for the West, but for the special operations community, it was a tactical university. The phantoms of the jungle proved that you cannot kill an idea with a bomb, but you can dismantle an insurgency with a scalpel. The men who served in Vietnam are old now. Many have passed away, taking their stories with them. But every time a modern special forces operator moves silently through a tree line, freezes at the sound of a snapping twig, or decides to let an enemy pass in order to gather intelligence, the ghost of the Australian SAS in Vietnam walks with them. Wars eventually end, treaties are signed, borders are redrawn, and armies go home. But the truth of what happened in the deep jungle doesn't survive in government archives or medal citations. It survives in the memories of the men who were there. For decades after the Vietnam War, the effectiveness of the Australian SAS was largely a matter of internal record. We knew the kill ratios, we knew the patrol reports, but we only had half the story. We knew what the Phantoms did, but we didn't know how it felt to be haunted by them. That changed in the 1990 seconds and early 2000s when diplomatic relations between Australia and Vietnam normalized. Historians, filmmakers, and veterans began to return to the battlefields of Phuc Tui. They went back to the Nui Dat base, now overgrown with rubber trees. They went back to the Long High Hills, and they finally sat down with the men who had been on the other side of the rifle, the Viet Cong VC, and the North Vietnamese Army NVA. What they found was a level of professional respect that is rare between former enemies. In interviews conducted for documentaries and historical research, former Viet Cong commanders spoke candidly. Their assessment of the Australian forces was consistent and chilling. They drew a sharp, distinct line between the Americans and the Australians. One former VC platoon leader, operating in the Hat Dick area, described the Americans as loud and heavy. "We were never afraid of the Americans," he said through a translator. "We were afraid of their artillery, yes. We were afraid of their B-52 seconds. But the soldiers? No, we knew where they were. They smoked cigarettes that we could smell. They talked. They walked on the trails. When they moved, the birds flew away. We could prepare the ambush, fire, and disappear before they knew what happened. Then his tone shifted when asked about the Australians. The Australians were different. They were like us. They walked in the mud. They did not use trails. They were patient. We would set an ambush for the Americans and wait for days. But with the Australians, we would find that they had been behind us, watching us the whole time. This confirmation validates the entire British-Australian doctrine. The VC admitted that the psychological pressure of fighting the SAS was exhausting. In a guerrilla war, the guerrilla usually holds the initiative. They choose when to fight. The SAS took that initiative away. Another former NVA officer shared a story about the avoidance orders. He confirmed the existence of the directives found by intelligence officers during the war. Our superiors told us, "Do not look for trouble with the Australians." It was not worth the cost, he explained. If you kill one American, his friends get angry and make noise. If you try to kill one Australian, you might lose 10 men, and you still won't find him. They were not worth the bullet. This is perhaps the highest compliment a special forces unit can receive, being deemed too dangerous to engage by a hardened enemy. There were also poignant moments of reconciliation. In 2002, a group of Australian SAS veterans returned to Vietnam to visit the site of a fierce firefight. They met with the local Vietnamese Veterans Association. These were men in their 60 seconds and 70 seconds. Frail, skin weathered by the Sunday. They shook hands. They shared tea. They looked at maps. One SAS veteran described a moment where he pointed to a ridgeline on a map and explained how his patrol had lain there for 3 days, observing a VC camp. A Vietnamese veteran's eyes widened. He pointed to the same spot and explained that he was the commander of that camp. He said, "We searched for you. We knew someone was there. The birds were quiet, but we never found you." The two old soldiers laughed. It was a dark, ironic laughter, the kind that only people who have stared death in the face can share. The Vietnamese veterans expressed a grudging admiration for the SAS's discipline. They noted that the Australians didn't burn villages indiscriminately. They were professional killers, yes, but they were soldiers who followed a code. The VC saw the SAS as worthy enemies. In Asian martial culture, and indeed in military history, the concept of the worthy enemy is significant. It means that your opponent fought with skill, honor, and courage. To the Viet Cong, the Americans were often seen as a technological juggernaut, a machine to be broken. The Australians were seen as warriors to be outsmarted. And often, the VC admitted, they were the ones who got outsmarted. These post-war conversations revealed that the British school of jungle warfare had worked better than anyone realized. The British taught the Australians to be jungle-minded. The Viet Cong were jungle-minded by birth. The fact that the Australians foreigners from a dry continent could come into the VC's backyard and beat them at their own game was a source of frustration, fear, and ultimately, respect. The legacy of the SAS in Vietnam is often buried under the politics of the war. But when you strip away the politics, you are left with the testimony of the men who fought. The Americans went home leaving behind a devastated landscape. The Australians went home leaving behind a ghost story, a legend of Ma Rung that is still whispered in the villages of Phuc Tuy today. In April 1975, the Vietnam War ended with some of the most chaotic and noisy images in history. Helicopters pushing other helicopters off the decks of aircraft carriers, tanks rolling through the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon, and desperate crowds scaling the walls of the U.S. Embassy. It was a loud, tragic conclusion to a conflict defined by overwhelming volume. But the Australian SAS had left Vietnam years earlier, and they left the same way they arrived, quietly, without fanfare, and undefeated. They did not win the war. No single unit, no matter how elite, could have changed the geopolitical tides or the strategic failures that doomed the South Vietnamese government. But on the tactical level in the sweating, green hell of Phuc Tuy province, the SAS achieved a silent victory that remains a gold standard in military history. As we close the file on the Phantoms of the Jungle, we are left with a final question. What made them the perfect soldiers for an imperfect war? The answer lies in a unique alchemy, a blend of history, geography, and mindset that can be summarized as the British brain, the Australian heart, and the Vietnam crucible. The British brain provided the software. The SAS didn't invent jungle warfare. They inherited it. The British lessons from Malaya taught them that an insurgency is not a nail to be hammered, but a disease to be treated. It taught them that patience is a weapon, and that restraint, knowing when not to shoot, is often the difference between life and death. The Australian heart provided the hardware. The men who joined the SASR were often bushmen, farmers, or laborers. They came from a culture that valued endurance, skepticism of authority, and mateship. They didn't have the rigid, top-down hierarchy of the American military. If a private saw a booby trap that the lieutenant missed, he spoke up. This egalitarianism made their patrols flexible and adaptive. They were tough men from a harsh continent, naturally suited to the rigors of the wild. The Vietnam Crucible was the final test. It took those theories and those men and stripped them of everything unnecessary. It taught them that technology is a crutch. In the jungle, radios fail, batteries die, and rifles jam. The only things that don't fail are your eyes, your ears, and the man next to you. The SAS proved that in the age of the machine gun and the jet fighter, the most dangerous thing on the battlefield is still a single, well-trained human being. While the American military complex spent billions of dollars trying to turn the jungle into a parking lot, the SAS accepted the jungle on its own terms. They realized that you cannot conquer nature, you have to surrender to it. You have to let the leeches bite you, let the rain soak you, and let the mud cover you. Only by submitting to the environment could they master the enemy within it. This is a profound lesson that extends beyond warfare. It is a lesson in humility. The Americans failed in Vietnam largely because of arrogance, the belief that superior firepower and technology could overcome culture, history, and terrain. The Australians succeeded in their sector because of humility, the admission that they were vulnerable, which made them careful, which made them lethal. The legacy of the Australian SAS in Vietnam is not found in monuments. There are no grand statues of SAS troopers in the parks of Canberra or Perth. That wouldn't be their style. Their legacy is found in the doctrine manuals of every modern special forces unit in the world. Today, when a U.S. Navy SEAL team conducts a reconnaissance mission, or when British SAS operators surveil a terrorist cell, they are using the playbook refined in Phuc 2. The concept of the small, autonomous team, highly trained, lightly equipped, and operating on the razor's edge of risk is the direct descendant of those four-man patrols. The jungle has long since reclaimed the battlefields. The rubber trees of the Long Tan rubber plantation still grow in straight rows. The caves of the Long High Hills are silent. The claymore wires have rusted away, and the footprints of the patrols have been washed clean by 50 monsoons. But among the older generation in the villages of southern Vietnam, the memory persists. They remember the Americans with a mix of anger and pity, loud giants who brought fire from the sky. But they remember the Australians with a shiver. They remember the time when the jungle, which had always been their protector, suddenly felt like it had eyes. They remember the fear of the Ma Rung, and that is the ultimate epitaph for the Australian SAS in Vietnam. They became something more than soldiers. They became a myth. In a war where the enemy controlled the shadows, the Australians stepped into the darkness and became the thing the shadows feared. They came, they watched, they struck, and then, like ghosts, they vanished.